One of the tricky things about reading through the male historiographical lens is recognizing that those men who were writing in the late 19th and 20th century were a product of their times, and with their own contemporary expectations of women's power, of women's exertion of that power. And so they are bringing to the Roman record their expectation from the 19th and 20th century of how women should act. And so oftentimes you have these male scholars who are under-interpreting the role of women in some of the sources we have from Roman antiquity. And you have two schools of thought on this. Some scholars are incredibly positivist, and they want to read against the grain and see extreme amounts of women's political action. And then you also have the pessimists who tend more towards that traditional male historiographical lens, who want to underplay any possibility of women's involvement. So you're always struggling between those two poles of over-interpreting the evidence, which we don't want to do, with a more late 20th, early 21st century activist feminist gaze. So we don't want to over-interpret, but we also don't want to fall into the trap of early 20th century male gaze at women, under-interpreting women. So we want to find a balance between those two. Julia Domna is this fascinating imperial woman who dates from around the year 200. She was married to the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus, who reigned from 193 to 211. And during her husband's power, she was able to exert a great deal of political power herself. She had a coterie of literary geniuses, guys like Dio Cassius, or Cassius Dio, a major Roman historian who comes from around the year 200. So Julia Domna was able to assert a great deal of political power, a great deal of economic power, both on her own and through her husband. And what's incredibly striking about Julia Domna is that when her husband dies, when her husband Septimius Severus dies, it is her son who becomes the next emperor, Caracalla, and she helps him in his imperial exertion of power. But once she has died, and once her son Caracalla also dies, it is not a male through the line of Caracalla and through the line of Septimius Severus who becomes the next emperor, but it is her sister's daughter's son, Elagabalus, who becomes the next emperor. And so we have this major Roman imperial dynasty that is defined not by male lineage, but rather by the woman's lineage. So Julia Domna exerts great power, but she also exerts great power through her family, and who becomes the next emperor after her husband and her son both die. And she's just this fabulous example of women's power, and women's power from the edges. She's a woman who comes from Syria. She marries her North African husband, Septimius Severus, and then she comes to the center, the heart of the Roman Empire, and is able to exert her power from Rome and beyond. So she's this fabulous example of a powerful Roman woman. Now the problem with Julia Domna, and I know this is kind of a long answer, but the problem with Julia Domna is she's so powerful that our sources that talk about her describe her in incredibly unfavorable ways. They describe her unfavorably, they describe her son, Caracalla, unfavorably, they describe Elagabalus, who rules after her son, incredibly unfavorably. But it's Elagabalus who gives us, or the sources for Elagabalus, they give us this mention of this woman's senate, this Senaculum, or Conventus Matronarum, that got me so excited about thinking about, what's the reality of this thing? I know that I'm learning about it in an incredibly hostile tradition, one that has problems with Julia Domna, problems with Caracalla, problems with Elagabalus. And so the way that source represented this woman's senate made me want to know more. Yeah, so it's great stuff. We see some fabulous examples of women exerting their political power, not necessarily through the right to vote. I mean, that's where we think women's power comes from, and in our modern 20th century notions of women's power. It's not through the right to vote, but it's through the right to exert their economic power, where we see women active in politics. So a great example where we see some of this playing out is in the debates over the repeal of a law called the Lex Oppia in the year 195 BCE. This is just after the Second Punic War has resolved, and women who under the Lex Oppia had been asked to give up the trappings of their wealth, no longer wearing gold, no longer riding in elaborate chariots and in large processions. They had been asked to give up that exertion of their wealth in the heart of the Second Punic War, when Hannibal was ravaging Italy, or there was terror of him. After that war is concluded, these women want their trappings back. They want their wealth back, and they lobby for the repeal of the Oppian Law, and they lobby openly in public spaces, in public political spaces. And the evidence we have for this is the Roman author Livy, writing during the reign of Augustus, who was aware of very powerful women in his own time, women like Livia, wife of Augustus. He is writing about this moment 200 years earlier, when women were openly lobbying for, or exerting political power, lobbying for their husbands to vote in a particular way, and they're successful. And Cato, Carthago delinda est Cato, is so frustrated with these women. He's frustrated with the husbands for allowing their women to go out into the public spaces. So we have this moment with the repeal of the Lex Oppia, where women exert a great deal of power to influence the outcome of a vote. But we have several moments along the way with powerful women, women like Aemilia Paula, who has a great deal of wealth in the first quarter of the 2nd century BCE. We have women like Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, who has a great deal of wealth and influence. We have women like Hortensia, who gives that famous speech which is essentially a no taxation without representation speech. We have women with a great deal of power and influence who are subject to witchcraft trials in the 1st century CE. And then we have a whole host of powerful women in the 1st and 2nd century CE who use their wealth to build very prominent male civic spaces. So there's, starting 200 BCE through to the time of Julia Domna, 400 years later, we have women exerting not the power to vote, but the power to exert their economic wealth in ways that can have a political impact. Women were seen as an extension of their husbands. Certain women were seen as an extension of certain women's husbands. And the more elite you were, the more, as a woman, the way that you acted was a reflection on your very public husband. So a great example of this is something called the so-called Laudatiatoria, which is a famous inscription that comes from the end of the 1st century BCE. And it's an inscription that is put up by a man praising his wife. And it's an incredibly long inscription, especially incredibly long for talking about a woman. But what you realize when you're reading against the grain, digging through this inscription, is this man who is praising his wife is doing so in a way that reflects positively onto himself. So he praises her woolworking. He praises her loyalty. He praises her, all the traditional female virtues. And you might ask yourself, why would a guy put up this kind of inscription for his wife? And the answer, of course, is that it praises him as well. This is a monument not just to the wife. I mean, it is a monument to the wife, but it's also a monument to himself, because he's the kind of guy who has that kind of woman. And so in a way, this man's political end is bolstered by having the right kind of wife. Does that answer your question? So it's men essentially asserting their own power and their own propriety by saying, I have the right kind of wife. And it's not just the Laudatiatoria. It goes way back. It goes back to the founding of the Republic. many of us know that story of Lucretia, the chaste Lucretia, who stabs herself rather than let tyranny prevail. And it's the men associated with her who then hold up this dagger as a way to motivate others. But the men who do that are some of the founding men of the Republic, and they are her relatives and her kinsmen, who are essentially grounding their authority to found this new political institution on the chastity of this woman who has killed herself to protect her virtue. So this notion of the virtuous woman being the heart of the properly political male goes back to the founding of the Republic and is going to extend through hundreds and hundreds of years of Roman history. Do you remember the part where Commodus is all up in Lucilla's face and he's saying, busy bee, buzz, buzz, buzz. It's super creepy because you have this brother trying to foist his incestuous self on the sister who gives into it to protect her son. Right. And I think that trickiness of women's position that you see in that scene is perfect for imagining what it must have been like for Julia Domna in that moment where, as I described, where you've got Gita clasping the legs of his mother when his brother, Julia Domna's son, has come to assassinate him, and you just get that poignant sense of the heart-wrenching power that these women exerted, and what choice do you make at that moment? Right. A Julia Domna or Commodus' sister Lucilla, as portrayed in the movie Gladiator. But I just love that scene because it shows the tension and the internal torture. Right. One of these powerful women who's living in the midst of men driven insane through absolute power. How does she conduct herself?